The rooftop bar in Manhattan was buzzing with laughter and conversation, the kind of effortless charm that only old money and new success could create. Evan Carter sat back in his leather seat, swirling the whiskey in his glass, barely listening to the chatter around him. The alumni reunion was a week away, and as always, his old friends were making bets, seeing who would turn up with the most impressive date. "Come on, Evan, you can't show up alone," Jake smirked, raising his glass. "You're a goddamn tech millionaire now. You need to make an entrance. Supermodel, actress, hell, even a billionaire's daughter. Someone worthy of Evan Carter." Laughter erupted around the table, but Evan just exhaled slowly, the same smug confidence he had carried since college still lingering in his expression. "Haven't really thought about it," he said, setting his glass down. Mark leaned forward, grinning. "All right, how about this? What if you show up with Julia Thompson?" For the first time that evening, Evan actually paused. The name felt like something pulled from another lifetime, a distant memory he hadn't touched in years. "Julia!" Jake barked out a laugh. "You mean the ugliest girl in our class? Man, that girl was a walking disaster, always hiding behind those giant glasses, drowning in sweaters 3 sizes too big. What a mess." Evan didn't laugh. He barely remembered Julia beyond the fact that she had always been quiet, always alone, always the subject of whispers and cruel jokes. He never took part, but he never stopped it either. Lisa, the only woman at the table, rolled her eyes. "You guys are unbelievable. Julia was sweet. Just because she didn't fit your ridiculous beauty standards doesn't mean she deserved the way people treated her." Yeah, Jake waved her off. "All I'm saying is, it'd be hilarious. Evan, think about it. Big shot CEO shows up with little Julia Thompson on his arm. Everyone would lose their minds." Mark grinned. "Unless you're afraid?" Evan arched a brow, leaning back in his chair. "Afraid?" Jake smirked. "It's just a bet, man. Unless you think you'll actually care what people say." A challenge. That's what they were playing at. Evan had spent years proving he was untouchable, that nothing and no one could shake him. He took a slow sip of his drink, letting the moment stretch. Then he smirked. "Fine, I'll ask her." The table roared with laughter and clinking glasses. Lisa shook her head. "Just be nice to her, Evan." He only nodded. Later that night, in his sleek penthouse, Evan sat at the edge of his bed, phone in hand. He found her number through their alumni group and hesitated, thumb hovering over the screen. This was supposed to be nothing more than a bet, just another night out with old friends. He typed out the message. "Hey, Julia, it's Evan Carter. Long time no see. Want to be my date for the reunion?" Seconds later, his phone buzzed. "Hi, Evan. Wow, I didn't expect to hear from you. Sure, I'd love to." Evan frowned slightly. That was, easy. No hesitation, no reluctance, no questions. For the first time since the idea had been thrown out, he felt something he hadn't expected. Curiosity. Evan arrived early at the Velvet Lounge, a high-end cocktail bar nestled in the heart of Manhattan. The low hum of jazz music mixed with the quiet murmur of well-dressed patrons, the scent of aged whiskey lingering in the air. He settled into a booth near the window, absently swirling the drink in his hand while his mind wandered. He still wasn't sure why he was here. Julia Thompson. He barely remembered her. She had been a background presence, a shadow in the halls of their elite private school. Too quiet, too awkward, too invisible. And now, years later, she had agreed to meet him without hesitation. He checked his watch, a slight smirk pulling at his lips. Maybe she hadn't changed. Maybe this would be just another amusing night, a funny story to tell later. The door to the bar swung open. Evan looked up and froze. A woman stepped inside, pausing just briefly as her gaze swept across the room. Her long, chestnut brown hair cascaded in soft waves down her shoulders, her sleek black dress fitting her in a way that turned more than a few heads. The dim lighting of the bar caught the sharp lines of her features, striking, confident, effortlessly elegant. There was no way. No way. She turned and their eyes met. Julia Thompson smiled. Evan barely remembered standing up. She approached the table, moving with an effortless grace, and slid into the seat across from him. "Evan," she greeted, her voice smooth, calm. It's been a while. He stared. Julia. Her lips twitched. Expecting someone else? He blinked, scrambling to regain control of the conversation. I, uh, yeah, I mean, no, wow. She let out a soft laugh, the kind that came from someone who knew exactly what she was doing. It's been 10 years, she said, crossing her legs. People change. Evan exhaled, leaning back. This was not the girl he remembered. The girl from high school wouldn't have sat in front of him like this. Calm, self-assured, completely in control of the moment. He studied her, eyes narrowing slightly. So, what have you been up to, Julia Thompson? She tilted her head, amusement flickering in her expression. I run my own fashion brand. Evan's brows lifted slightly. Fashion? He hadn't expected that. She smirked as if reading his thoughts. You assumed I'd still be that girl in oversized sweaters and bag glasses, didn't you? He chuckled, shaking his head. I honestly didn't know what to expect. Well, she lifted her glass, taking a sip of wine. Surprise. Silence stretched between them for a moment. Not awkward, charged. Evan set his drink down. So why did you say yes? She shrugged, her expression unreadable. Why did you ask? His smirk faltered just slightly. She wasn't playing into whatever script he thought this night would follow. Before he could answer, she leaned in slightly. Tell me something, Evan, she said, resting her chin on her hand. Was this your idea? Or was this a bet? His jaw tensed. She knew. Of course, she knew. And yet, she still showed up. Evan held her gaze, debating his next move. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't the one in control. Julia Thompson was no one's punchline anymore, and something about that fact unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Evan exhaled slowly, buying himself a moment. He could lie. He could spin some charming excuse, pretend this was just a friendly reunion, but something about the way Julia watched him, calm, steady, completely unshaken, made him hesitate. He set his glass down. Would you believe me if I said it didn't matter anymore? Julia's lips curved, just slightly. That's not an answer, he smirked. It's the best you're getting. For a moment, she simply studied him. Then, to his complete surprise, she laughed. Genuine, light, almost amused. Honest, she murmured, tilting her wine glass in acknowledgement. I'll take that. Evan wasn't sure why, but something in his chest eased. Julia wasn't angry. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't playing the victim. She was entertained, amused at the entire situation, as if she had already figured out how this was going to play out, and he was just catching up. All right, she said, leaning back. We'll go to the reunion together. Evan blinked. Just like that? Just like that. He narrowed his eyes. No hesitation? She smiled, sipping her wine. Why should I hesitate? Because this wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was supposed to be hesitant, nervous, grateful. Instead, she was calling the shots. And for the first time in a long time, Evan Carter, the man who built an empire from nothing, who thrived on control, felt like he was the one walking into something he didn't fully understand. All right, he finally said, leaning back. Let's do it. She raised her glass. To reunions, then. He clinked his glass against hers, eyes never leaving her face. There was something different about Julia Thompson, something dangerous. And suddenly, this wasn't just about proving a point to his friends. This was about figuring her out. A few nights later, Evan leaned against the wall of an upscale designer boutique, watching as Julia stepped out of the dressing room in a sleek red gown. He wasn't sure why he was here. After their drink at the Velvet Lounge, they had started texting. Then they started meeting up. Coffee, dinner, late-night walks through the city. It didn't feel forced. It didn't even feel like a game anymore. And that was the problem. Julia smoothed a hand over the fabric of the gown, glancing at herself in the mirror. Too much? Evan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Not at all. She turned, raising an eyebrow. You sure? You look like you just had a revelation. He smirked. I think I did. Julia's lips twitched. And what's that? Evan took a step closer, lowering his voice. I might have underestimated you. She tilted her head, amused. Took you long enough. They held each other's gaze. Something had shifted between them. Evan didn't know what. He just knew he wasn't the one in control anymore. And strangely, he didn't mind. The night before the reunion, Evan and Julia found themselves at a rooftop bar overlooking the city, the skyline stretching endlessly behind them. The air was crisp, the glow of streetlights reflecting off glass buildings, casting a warm shimmer over the bustling streets below. Evan leaned on the railing, watching Julia as she sipped her wine, effortlessly at ease. For the past week, things had been different. What started as a dare, a game, had turned into something else. He had meant for this to be a joke, a passing amusement. So why did he enjoy being around her? Why did he look forward to their late-night conversations, her sarcastic jabs, the way she saw through him like no one else ever had? "What's on your mind, Carter?" Julia's voice broke through his thoughts. He smirked, shifting his gaze to her. "You always assume I'm thinking something?" "You always are." She leaned against the railing beside him, tilting her head. "You get that look when you're trying to figure something out." He chuckled. "And what do you think I'm trying to figure out?" She considered him, her gaze steady. "Whether or not you're still in control of this situation." His smirk faltered for just a second. She saw right through him. Julia set her glass down, crossing her arms. "Let me save you the trouble, Evan." "You're not." He exhaled a slow laugh. "I should have known better than to think I had the upper hand with you." "Yeah, you should have." She turned to look out at the city, her expression unreadable. "You thought I'd be easy to impress, that I'd be flattered, maybe even grateful. That's what this was supposed to be, right? An easy win?" Evan didn't say anything, because she wasn't wrong. He had walked into this assuming he had the power, that she would be the one proving something. But he had been wrong, so damn wrong. Julia turned back to him, her voice quieter now. "Here's the real question, Evan. Why do you still want to go to this reunion with me?" Evan opened his mouth, then shut it. She held his gaze, waiting. And for the first time in years, Evan Carter had no idea what to say. Because if this was still a game, he didn't know who was playing who anymore. The night of the reunion. The ballroom was packed. Laughter, clinking glasses, flashes of expensive jewelry and tailored suits, the past and present colliding in one extravagant display. Evan stepped through the grand entrance, adjusting the cuffs of his suit, his usual confidence in place. But then Julia walked in beside him, and the room fell silent. Gasps, whispers, stares. Because the woman standing next to Evan Carter wasn't the girl they remembered. She was poised, stunning, her red gown hugging her figure effortlessly. She moved with an ease that said she belonged here, that she didn't need anyone's validation. Jake, Mark, and the rest of their old crowd stood frozen, their drinks halfway to their mouths. Evan smirked. They had no idea what hit them. "Holy shit," Jake muttered under his breath. Mark was blinking like he had just seen a ghost. That's Julia Thompson?" Julia smiled politely, ignoring the stares as she walked deeper into the ballroom. But Evan could feel it, the tension, the disbelief, and beneath it all, something else, something darker. Because this wasn't over. Not yet. The reunion was in full swing, glasses clinking, old friends reconnecting, conversations filled with laughter and nostalgia. But amidst the music and chatter, there was an undercurrent of whispers. People weren't just talking about the past. They were talking about Julia. Jake, Mark, and the rest of Evan's old crowd watched from across the room, their shock barely hidden behind forced smiles and raised glasses. "Damn," Jake muttered, shaking his head as he took another sip of his drink. "I can't believe it." "Julia Thompson," he let out a short laugh, nudging Mark. "Man, if we had known she'd turn out like this, we wouldn't have—" He stopped himself, but it was already too late. Because Julia had heard him. Evan saw the way her fingers tightened slightly around the stem of her wine glass, the flicker of something cold in her eyes. But she didn't react, not in the way they expected. Instead, she turned smoothly, stepping toward them with a quiet, deadly confidence. "Wouldn't have what?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. Her voice was calm, almost amused, but there was steel underneath. Jake shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. "Nothing. Just, you know, surprised to see you." Mark, ever the instigator, smirked. Yeah, Evan didn't tell us he was bringing someone, so he let his eyes sweep over her, dragging out the moment before finishing with, polished. Julia smiled. Slow. Sharp. Well, she said, lifting her glass to her lips, you know what they say. Time changes people. Jake chuckled, still trying to play it cool. Yeah, but some things don't change. He leaned closer, his grin widening. Like how you ended up here, for example. I mean, let's be real. Evan could have brought anyone, but he chose you. There it was, the dig, the implication, that no matter how much she had changed, she was still a joke to them, still the girl they dared him to bring. Evan felt his jaw clench, his patience thinning. But before he could step in, Julia set her glass down and smiled. Yeah, she said lightly. Funny, isn't it? How he thought he was choosing me. Jake's smirk faltered. What? Julia turned slightly, glancing at Evan. Let me ask you something, Carter, she mused. Did you think this would end the same way it started? The entire group fell silent. Evan held her gaze, something twisting deep inside him, because this wasn't what he expected. Jake chuckled, trying to brush off the tension. Come on, Julia. It was just a harmless bet. Julia finally looked back at him, amusement flickering in her eyes. Was it? Her voice was soft, but it sliced through the noise, through the music, through every ounce of arrogance in the room. Mark's smirk wavered. It was just for fun. You know, something to laugh about. Julia exhaled, shaking her head slightly. That's the difference between us, Mark. You laugh about the past, but I learn from it. She lifted her chin slightly, her next words sinking into the space between them. I grew. You stayed exactly the same. Silence. Evan knew then. This wasn't about them anymore. This was about her, about taking back her own story. And for the first time, he saw it clearly. Julia never needed this reunion. She never needed revenge. She had already won. He had just been too blind to see it. Jake scoffed, trying to laugh, but it sounded weak. All right, let's not get dramatic. Evan, back me up here. Evan didn't move. Jake's grin faltered. Dude? Evan finally spoke, his voice quieter than usual. She doesn't need me to. Julia glanced at him, and for the first time that night, her expression softened. Not in pity, not in amusement, but in understanding. And Evan Carter, the man who once thought he was the one in control of this game, realized something. He had been the one playing catch-up all along. The tension in the room was thick, a silent battlefield where no one dared to make the first move. Julia had won. Everyone knew it. But she wasn't here to gloat, wasn't here to tear anyone down. She had already outgrown them. Evan saw it in the way she carried herself, the way she didn't need to fight for their respect, because their opinions didn't matter anymore. Jake shifted awkwardly, downing the last of his drink. Well, this has been fun, he muttered, forcing a chuckle. Good seeing you, Julia. But as he turned to leave, Julia spoke. Jake? He froze. She tilted her head slightly, eyes steady. I forgave you years ago. I just forgot to let you know. Silence. Jake didn't say anything. He couldn't. Because what could he say? The girl he had once laughed at wasn't just standing in front of him. She was standing above him. He nodded once, gave a half-hearted grin, and walked away. Mark followed, mumbling something under his breath. Lisa, the only one who had spoken up for Julia in the beginning, stayed behind. I knew they were jerks back then, she said softly, but I should have done more. Julia smiled, and this time, it was genuine. You did more than most. Lisa exhaled, nodding before squeezing Julia's hand. It's good to see you happy. Then she turned, disappearing into the crowd. And suddenly it was just Evan and Julia. The music played on, the murmur of conversation swirling around them. But for the first time all night, Evan wasn't focused on anyone else. Just her. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. You never answered my question. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Which one? Why did you still want to go to the reunion with me? Evan didn't answer right away. He let the weight of the night settle over him, let everything that had led up to this moment finally sink in. Then finally he looked at her. Because it stopped being about them, he admitted. Stop being about proving a point. He let out a small, self-deprecating chuckle. At some point, I just wanted to be here, with you. Julia studied him for a moment, searching his face, measuring his words. Then, to his relief, she smiled. Evan Carter, she mused, admitting he was wrong. Now there's something I never thought I'd see. He smirked, shaking his head. Don't get used to it. She laughed, the sound soft, real. And for the first time in years, Evan felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Later that night, as they walked out into the city, the cool breeze carrying the scent of rain, Evan reached for her hand. To his surprise, she didn't pull away. She squeezed it once, a silent acknowledgement. No words, no promises, just something real. 1 year later, Julia stood on the stage of a packed venue, flashing cameras and murmuring voices filling the air. She was here, her own fashion brand, Thompson Atelier, her name on the walls, her designs on runways across the world. Evan stood at the back of the room watching, proud. She had built this. She had earned this, and he had been lucky enough to witness it.